Spending over $1,000 a month on a car payment seemed like a crazy idea just a few short years ago, but today it's become the new norm. And if you're in the market to buy a new car, you're probably weighing the pros and cons of making a smart financial decision, but also wanting to buy the car of your dreams. Well, today in our video, we're gonna look at 3 simple tips to make sure that you make a great financial decision when you purchase your next car. My name is Luke Turner, co-founder of Moen Private Wealth. We help athletes and entrepreneurs get smarter with their money. Let's dive into the 3 tips that's gonna help you make a great purchase. The 3 tips that we're gonna break down today. 1, the 24-10 rule. This is a very important rule that anybody can follow. And the great thing is, no matter what your income level is, you're gonna be able to utilize this rule. Number 2 is gonna be, should we buy a car or should we lease a car? This is gonna be very specific to your situation. So understanding the pros and cons will be very important. And then number 3, and lastly, what the dealership doesn't want you to know. As we dive into the video today, our whole goal in this process is to make sure that you're making a good financial decision as you focus on buying the car of your dreams. First tip is the 24-10 rule. So what do each of these numbers mean? Let's start with the first number, 20. This is 20% down. Okay, and there's no magic number around putting 20% down on your vehicle, but it's a really good indicator and a great starting point to determine your readiness to buy the vehicle that you are looking at. So an example here would be if you're gonna buy a $50,000 car, we typically would recommend making sure that at least 20% is going down, or $10,000. The big part about putting that 20% down is it's going to make the payment that you're gonna make on a monthly basis smaller. So the more money we put down on the car, the smaller the payment, okay? The next number that we have is 4. And 4 refers to the number of years that we are going to finance this car out. This is a very important figure, especially as we look at the way that dealerships make money and how good of a deal you're getting. Typically, the longer you finance a vehicle, the lower your payment's gonna be. But if you end up financing it, say for a 5 or a 7-year period, you're gonna pay significantly more in interest on the loan that you have, because it's gonna take you a much longer period in time to actually pay down the debt on that car. So typically, we wanna make sure that we are keeping our loan term at 4 years. So after 4 years, you should have that car fully paid off. If we do not feel comfortable with that loan payment or that car payment, we probably need to look at less car. And then that last number is our 10% number. And our 10% number is specific to you. It's looking at what is our total gross income on a monthly basis, and then multiplying that by 10%. So let's say your gross income is $10,000 a month, and 10,000 times 10% is gonna be $1,000. That $1,000 now represents the amount of car we believe you can afford on a monthly car payment, okay? So $10,000 a month means that the maximum you would wanna spend is $1,000 per month on your car payment. The nice thing though is if we start with the end in mind, if we're trying to have a 10% car payment, we can then back into adjusting some of those other levers, right? So if we're looking at our dream car and we're saying, well, if we put 20% down and we finance it over 4 years, the payment's gonna be $1,500 a month. And that's over and above our 10% threshold that we're talking about right now. We can then adjust some of those levers. We can either put more money down. So instead of the 20% down, maybe we put 50% down. Because remember, if we put more down on the car, it's gonna lower our car payment. Or when we look at the term, what we can do is we could extend out the term. But again, if we extend out the term, we need to be really careful because we're gonna be paying more in interest. Typically not a lever that we wanna pull, but a lever that you could pull if it was a must. So again, the first rule that we need to follow is the 24-10 rule. 20% down, 4-year term max, and 10% of your gross income is not exceeded with your car payment. So that's the first rule that we need to follow. Now let's look at the second rule. The second rule that we need to follow is buying versus leasing. Okay, and this is a big topic because when we look at buying versus leasing, it's typically really hard to determine what the best deal is and specifically what the best deal for me is. So what I like to do is I like to break this down into 2 side-by-sides. Okay, so on one side we're gonna have buying, on one side we're gonna have leasing. First, let's look at leasing a car. What are some of the pros to actually going out and leasing a car? Well, number one, the biggest obvious one, and the reason why most people lease cars is that you would put minimal down. I heard of somebody the other day, they leased a Tesla, they put $1,600 down, and they're only paying $250 a month, and they're getting a $7,500 tax credit. That's here nor there, that's a specific Tesla thing related to energy efficiency. But when we look at leasing, that's one of the pros. We can put less down, we typically can have a smaller payment, but one of the biggest cons to leasing a car is that at the end of that lease, the dealership is going to take that car back. You don't actually own anything. Think about it just like you're renting your apartment versus buying a house. Not that one of those is better than the other. For different people, it makes sense to buy. For other people, it makes sense to rent. But if you're renting, you're not putting any equity into that asset. Same way with a car. You're not putting any equity into your car if you are leasing that car. But for those of us that like new cars on a regular basis, call it every 3 to 4 years, typically it makes sense to look at leasing. Because when we look at the depreciation of a car, typically the majority of the depreciation, meaning if a car is worth $50,000 today, it's gonna reduce in value over time. Typically the largest portion of that depreciation happens in the first 3 to 4 years. So what we don't wanna do is we don't wanna buy a car and then 3 to 4 years later, we sell the car and buy a new car. Because that, from a financial perspective, is really gonna affect our bank account, okay? So those are the pros and cons of leasing, but now let's look at who should actually look at buying a car. So first and foremost, if you're looking at buying a car, typically the folks that it makes the most sense to buy a car are those that, we'll call it, they wanna drive their car into the ground. They wanna be in a position that we're gonna purchase the car, I'm gonna drive the car for 150,000 miles, I'm gonna keep it for 10 years, I'm gonna make sure that I do all my routine maintenance, I'm fine taking care of it, I'm fine if something breaks, and they're in a position that they're willing to drive that car for, I'll call it 8 to 10 years. Because again, the biggest piece that we want to look at is that depreciation. Typically, once we get out past 7 years, the depreciation on a car is really flat, meaning that the majority of the depreciation is already taken place, whether you drive that car for another 2 years or not. Typically, you're not going to experience a huge amount of additional depreciation. So for those of you that want to drive a car for a long period in time, typically buying can make a lot of sense. The other reason why buying can make a lot of sense is that at the end of the life of that car, you still get the opportunity to sell it. So as mentioned before with the leasing, when you get done with that lease, the dealership's going to take back your car. Whereas when you're buying a car, now you own this asset, and that asset is worth something, and you can sell that asset when you go to buy your new car. So buying versus leasing, there is no perfect right answer for you, but following those pros and cons can be a great option when you're trying to make that decision. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about, what the dealership doesn't want you to know. So when we think about the car dealership, one, car dealerships are really important. Without those car dealerships, we don't have an opportunity to go buy cars. Okay, so car dealerships aren't out to get you, but you do need to understand some basic concepts. And number one is financing. Okay, when you go to finance a car, typically the way that most dealerships are making money is through financing. Okay, so when we think about the financing component, when you walk into a dealership, one of the first questions they're gonna ask is, are you financing this car or are you gonna pay cash? If you're gonna pay cash, you immediately have been written off as probably not the best customer, because a lot of times the way that they make money is through financing. And frankly, dealerships have to make money some way, and there's nothing wrong with making it through financing. But it's really important to understand that. Because oftentimes when you're having a negotiation, if you're willing to finance the car, you're typically going to get a better price point. But it's important that if you're the person that wants to pay cash, understanding that if you finance that car, are there any, if you pay off that loan early, are there going to be any early payment penalties? Okay, so keep that in mind. Number two is when you buy a car from a dealership, the other way that they make money is often through extended warranties. And again, nothing wrong with extended warranties, but you need to be really mindful of what is the cost and then what are they actually covering. When you're buying that new car, you're gonna have a tendency to want to look into those warranties. Might be a good option depending on your financial situation, but something to be really mindful of. For me personally, every time I bought a car, I have never bought the warranty and I've never regretted not buying the warranty. But I've also heard of people who have bought the warranty. They've had some big electronic break in their car right after the factory warranty, and then they're in a position where everything's covered and they're very happy. Think about the warranty just like insurance. It puts you in a position that you're hedging your risk. If nothing happens, the dealership's gonna win. If something happens, you're probably gonna win. So those are the two things to keep in mind when you walk into the dealership that the dealership probably doesn't want you to know. But if you are looking to buy a new car, following those 3 tips that I just walked through is gonna put you in an amazing financial situation to make sure that 1, you don't buy too much car, and 2, you always feel like you've made that good, responsible financial decision. If you enjoyed this video, number 1, please subscribe. We're gonna be putting out more and more content around personal finance, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. And number 2, in the description below, there's another video that I think you might enjoy about how net worth can explode after $100,000. Hope you guys have a great day and see you next week.